Hey everyone, this is a piece by Dan Botz. It's titled Trotsky and Boris Souvarine Debate, the Soviet Union and the Communist Movement. Let me just make sure real quick that I'm pronouncing this name right.
Souvarine.
Souvarine. Okay. It says here that Dan Botz is from of the School of Labor Studies at the City University of New York and co-editor of New Politics. Here we go. If we know him at all, most of us know Boris. Maybe I should say, do look up his whole name. Maybe it's Boris Souvarine. Now I'm getting.
Boris.
Oh no, you say Boris. You say yes. Okay. If we know of him at all, most of us know Boris Souvarine, who lived from 1895 to 1984, for Boris Souvarine's monumental biography, Stalin, Aperçu historique du bolchevisme, originally published in France in 1935, later translated by C.L.R. James and published in English as Stalin, A Critical Survey of Bolshevism in 1939. Some may also know Souvarine as a Cold War anti-communist who ended up supporting the United States war against Vietnam in 1968. However, if you are familiar with either one of both or both of those and know nothing else about him, you will have a very limited picture of Souvarine, who was a major figure in the European communist movement for 10 years and a significant left intellectual on the revolutionary left for another decade. Souvarine was a founder of the French Communist Party, a leader of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, a member of its Presidium Bureau, and a significant figure in the communist opposition of the mid-1920s. Leon Trotsky wrote to Souvarine in 1929, asking Souvarine to become a collaborator with him. As Victor Serge wrote, quote, Souvarine, despite his expulsion from the Comintern in 1924, was for some 10 years to be one of the most trenchant and perceptive brains of European communism, end quote. Writing in 1939, Franz Birkenau of the Frankfurt School, author of World Communism, referred to him as, quote, one of the most far-sighted men in the Comintern, end quote. Yet by 1929, Souvarine would lock swords with Trotsky. To understand what happened, we should consider the context of their debate. The context: Russian economy, foreign policy, democratic rights. The mid to late 1920s represent a transition period between the new economic policy of state-regulated capitalist development and the beginnings of the collectivization of agriculture and industrialization around 1929. In this period, the principal debates about Russian domestic policy had to do with how to develop the Russian economy. Nikolai Bukharin and his allies, who came to be called the Right Opposition, wished to continue the new economic policy, state tutelage of capitalist growth, indefinitely. Trotsky and his left opposition wanted to struggle against the kulaks, the wealthy peasants, and a rapid pace of industrialization, while seeking to expand the revolution abroad. Stalin, leader of the so-called Center, first supported Bukharin, but later adopted Trotsky's economic program with a vengeance. Footnote: Alec Nova, An Economic History of the USSR, 1969. Provides a powerful overview of the economic arguments. End footnote. Trotsky joined in 1925 by Zinoviev and Kamenev in the United Opposition, argued that democracy in the party was necessary in order to break the power of the center and the right and pursue the policies that Trotsky advocated. During the same period, there was also a debate about international issues. The fundamental problem was the isolation of the Soviet Union after the waning of the European revolutionary movement that had begun in 1918. Benito Mussolini rose to Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, and the German Revolution was defeated in 1923. While there was at first general agreement on the policy of the United Front with other left and labor organizations, there was much debate about what that meant. From 1925 to 1927, there was an attempt to create an alliance between the Soviet Union and a section of the British labor movement through the Anglo-Russian Committee, but the General Council of Trade Unions opposed it, and it ended with the breaking of British-Soviet relations in 1927. The Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1920, was ordered by the Comintern in the winter of 1923 to enter the nationalist Kuomintang Party, KMT, which led in 1927 to the disastrous Shanghai Massacre, where the Kuomintang Party virtually destroyed the Communist Party of China. While Stalin and Bukharin led the Comintern through this period, Trotsky opposed their policies in Britain and China. In the summer of 1928, the Communist International declared the world entered a new revolutionary period, but that the Social Democrats and the Trotskyists had become, quote, social fascists, end quote, with whom no united front was possible. Finally, the third great debate of the era had to do with the question of democratic rights in the Soviet Union, and by extension in the Communist International and in the various communist parties. During the period of war communism from 1918 to 1920, the communist government had virtually eliminated all democratic rights. Multi-party democracy, the right to factions in the Communist Party, genuine elections in the Soviets, the party and the trade unions, vote by secret ballot, and freedom of the press. All party factions hesitated to extend democratic rights to the majority of the population, who were peasants, or to non-party members, or even to the communists of the working class, for fear that capitalist interests would enter into the party, end the Soviets, and undo the revolution. Zinoviev's Bolshevization campaign, launched at the Fifth Comintern Congress in the summer of 1924, became an anti-Trotskyist campaign, and in general suppressed dissent. A few years later, the United Opposition would call for democratic rights in the party, Soviets, and trade unions. The key question of the era was the relationship between democratic rights, the dynamic of the various social classes and interest groups, and a political program to save the Soviet Union and to build socialism. Would the revolution survive if the workers and beyond them the people had democratic rights? What was at issue in the Trotskyist Souvarine debates? It was the late 1920s, that Boris Souvarine engaged in a series of sharp disputes with Leon Trotsky about all of these issues. The questions they debated revolved around several of the most important theoretical and practical issues. What had happened to the Russian Revolution? What was the nature of the Soviet Union? And what was the character of the Communist Party? What had become the Communist International? What was the correct approach to the reconstruction of revolutionary parties and of a new revolutionary international? How would the leadership of such a new movement conduct itself? Many of these were the questions that Victor Serge and Trotsky would debate 10 years later, though in changed circumstances. Why should we revisit this debate from nearly a century ago? I think there are several reasons. First, because their debate is an attempt to understand the nature of the Soviet Union and the Communist International, which for 70 years played such a central role in world history and became such a problematic issue for the socialist movement. Second, but most important, because at the center of this debate is the question of the role of democratic rights in the struggle for socialism. And third, because it takes up the perennial and therefore also contemporary question, how do we build or rebuild a revolutionary socialist movement? Let me begin by introducing Souvarine. Who was Boris Souvarine? Boris Souvarine, who lived from 1895 to 1984, was born Boris Lifshitz to Russian Jewish parents in Kiev in 1895. His parents, attracted by the, quote, glow of the West, the land of liberty, end quote, moved to Paris in 1897, and Souvarine was naturalized as a French citizen in 1906. His father was a goldsmith, a, quote, elite worker, end quote, as his son later wrote, with a comfortable standard of living. At the age of 14, Souvarine followed him in the trade, though he later also worked briefly in an aircraft plant. Souvarine, quote, sympathized with socialist ideals, end quote, from 1910, part because of the railroad workers' strike that year. Souvarine read socialist publications and attended socialist meetings and joined protest demonstrations. Souvarine became an admirer of French socialist leader Jean Jaurès after hearing him speak. Conscripted into the French army in November 1913 due to an error on his birth certificate, his birth date being given as 1893 and not the correct 1895, Souvarine fought in the Battle of the Marne and saw with his own eyes the horrors of war. In 1915, Souvarine's brother, who had also been mobilized, was killed, a loss that contributed to Souvarine's radicalization. While in the army, Souvarine studied and learned or relearned, though he never seems to have perfected, the Russian language of his early childhood, a decision that would be significant for his future political activity. He was permitted to leave the army in 1916, at which time he took the pseudonym Souvarine from a Russian anarchist character in Émile Zola's Germinal. Or Germinal. Souvarine joined the Section Français de Internationale Ouvrière, SFIO, the French Socialist Party, and began in 1916 to write for Le Populaire, the pacifist newspaper of Jean Longuet, a grandson of Karl Marx. So Jean Longuet was Jean-Laurent Frederick Longuet was a French socialist politician and journalist. He was Karl Marx's grandson. Sorry, I was just looking at the Wikipedia. The grandson of Karl Marx. It was the beginning of what would become a lifelong career in journalism. Souvarine became part of the SFIO's left-wing minority and joined the Committee in Defense of International Socialism that opposed a, quote, war to the end, end quote. A letter written by Souvarine, quote, to our Swiss friends, end quote, brought Souvarine to the attention of Lenin and immediately into a controversy with him. The SFIO and even its left wing to which Souvarine belonged had a, quote, defensist, end quote, policy. So Lenin's break with the Socialist International and his call to turn the war into revolution shocked the young French socialist. Though still, at that same time, Souvarine was attracted by the Bolsheviks' call for peace without annexations or indemnities. When the Russian Revolution of 1917 occurred, Souvarine greeted it with joy and became a correspondent for Gorky's newspaper, Novaya Zhin, founded that year. While strongly identifying with the Russian revolutionary movement, Souvarine had reservations, much like those of Trotsky and Luxemburg, about Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Writing in the anarchist newspaper, Ce qu'il faut dire, I don't know if I'm saying that right, what must be said, Souvarine stated, quote, it is to be feared that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, might become the dictatorship of Bolsheviks and their leader, which would be an unfortunate development not only for the Russian working class, but for the world, end quote. Yet only a few months later, Souvarine would be completely won over by Lenin, and by 1919 was writing pamphlets that glorified the Bolsheviks, approved the dismissal of the Constituent Assembly, supported the Soviet regime, and justified the Red Terror against the enemies of the revolution. Hold on. There's a link here that I need to save. Okay, I'm just looking at these footnotes. Sorry, I know this is fucking annoying. Okay, sorry about that. New section. Souvarine and the Comintern. Souvarine first took up the cause of the International through the Committee for the Resumption of International Relations, and then through the Committee of the Third International, becoming, quote, one of the moving spirits of the organization, end quote. In 1919, Souvarine was one of the most vigorous advocates for the affiliation of the French Socialists to the Comintern, and, despite the fact that as part of a government crackdown on the left he had been convicted on charges of sedition and imprisoned, Souvarine was elected a co-president of the Tour Congress of the SFIO. Souvarine wrote for the Congress the resolution that led to the creation of the Communist Party in March of 1920. Still in prison, Souvarine was unable to attend the Second Congress of the Communist International held in Moscow in July-August 1920. Once free, however, Souvarine had begun to publish the Bulletin Communiste that unequivocally and wholeheartedly supported all of the decisions of the Comintern. As Janine Verdes Leroux writes, quote, Souvarine was perceived and described as an intransigent and disturbing man, a man of the International, not a man of the French Communist Party, end quote. After his release from prison, Souvarine went to Moscow for the Third Congress of the Comintern held in June and July 1921, and now a Comintern leader, he stayed on through 1922. He was elected to the Comintern Presidium Bureau, to its Executive Committee, and to its International Secretariat. As one historian writes, quote, at a very young age, Souvarine was thus the most prominent Frenchman in Moscow, aided no doubt by his affinity with Russia, his knowledge of the Russian language, and his enthusiasm for the new regime, end quote. Zinoviev put Souvarine in charge of international correspondence, the Third International's most important publication then printed in Berlin. Interested in understanding the views of revolutionary dissidents in Russia, upon his arrival in Moscow for the Third Comintern Congress, Souvarine made a visit to Butyrka prison to speak with anarchists being held there by the Soviet regime, and he later met with Alexander Shliapnikov and Alexander Kollontai, leaders of the workers' opposition, as well as talking with the independent-minded scholar David Ryazanov, with whom he also became friends. During the course of his stay in Russia in the early 1920s, Souvarine became a good friend of Nikolai Bukharin, worked closely with Zinoviev, and collaborated with Trotsky. Loyal to the International and sympathetic to its left wing, Souvarine returned for a time to France in 1923, where he, quote, called for a general purge of reformists, arrivistes, etc. What the hell does that mean? An ambitious or ruthlessly self-seeking person, especially one who has recently acquired wealth or social status. Yeah, he called for quote a general. He quote called for a general purge of reformists and arrivistes, etc. End quote. Quality, integrity were more important than quantity. End quote. A strident left-winger, Souvarine found himself embroiled in constant conflict with the French party leadership. Re-elected to the Presidium Bureau of the International in June 1923, Souvarine began to come under attack from Zinoviev, and he responded in kind. As the succession fight heated up in the Comintern, Souvarine spoke out frankly to Zinoviev, stating his disgust with the situation, writing to him on February 6, 1924, that, quote, "There are a good many things I believe are inadmissible both in the Russian party and in Soviet life in general," end quote. And at an April 4th meeting of Federation of the Sen chapter of the Communist... I gotta actually look up how to say that, because I always say Sen, but I've also heard people say Seine, like the river. So we're gonna find out together. Hopefully some of you also don't know, so I'm not just wasting everyone's time.
Seine.
Sen. All right. You know what I'm saying? At an April 4th meeting of the Federation of the Sen chapter of the Communist Party French section of the Communist International, PCSFIC, he stated, quote, "There is something rotten in the party and in the International," end quote. What Souvarine meant by that, of course, was the bureaucratization of the party that Trotsky had described, the persecution of Trotsky, and the suppression of internal debate, which would reach a crescendo in Zinoviev's Bolshevization campaign, initiated in 1924. I'll just say the definition, according to Wikipedia, of the Bolshevization means Bolshevization was the process in the mid-1920s by which the pluralistic Communist International and its constituent communist parties were increasingly subjected to pressure by the Kremlin in Moscow to follow Marxism-Leninism. The Comintern became a tool of Soviet foreign policy. The policy downplayed autonomy in favor of support for the Soviet Union and its foreign policy. During the Fifth Congress of the Comintern in 1924, Bolshevization became the general principle. The Sixth Congress in 1928 took a radical turn as the Comintern decided that capitalism was reaching its final stages. There was less support for wars of national liberation in colonial regions, especially after the collapse of the Comintern in China. In the Italian Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci took the lead in promoting Bolshevization. In Prague, it was Klement Gottwald who came to power in the Communist Party of the Czechoslovakia by taking charge of Bolshevization, and he would be the leader, I believe, of Czechoslovakia in the post-World War II era. Yeah, it actually says that right here. Anyway, back to the text, just to clarify what Bolshevization entailed. All of this tension worsened after Souvarine translated in 1924, published in France, Trotsky's book, The New Course, writing a preface praising him. The New Course was Trotsky's brilliant analysis and program for the Russian Communist Party, and it was also his manifesto and his struggle against other party leaders. It laid out his central ideas, quote, "In the last analysis, the question will be resolved by two great factors of international importance, the course of the revolution in Europe and the rapidity of our economic development," end quote. And to achieve these goals, Trotsky argued it would be necessary to overcome the bureaucratic tendencies and democratize the party. At the 12th Party Congress of April 1923, quote, Trotsky's proposals were unanimously endorsed by the whole leadership, end quote. Nevertheless, between 1924 and 1927, all top leaders resisted the program they had initially adopted, and the leadership began a campaign against Trotsky. Souvarine came down on Trotsky's side. Jules Humbert Droz, the member of the Comintern executive responsible for the Latin countries of Europe, makes clear the significance of Souvarine's action. Quote, contrary to what had been done with the workers' opposition, the International did not publish the documents of the Trotskyist opposition, and the delegates, to the Fifth Congress, were never informed except by the most contradictory rumors that circulated in the halls of the Congress. Only Souvarine had made Trotsky's documents available, which led to a sharp attack and his exclusion from the International, end quote. Footnote. Jules Droz, de Lenin à Stalin. Humbert Droz, a right communist who came out against Trotsky, was no admirer of Souvarine. As he wrote to his wife in 1924, quote, you know that my thoughts have been about Souvarine, a petty bourgeois intellectual who tends to become a big bourgeois and who has no place in a proletarian party. The trouble is that serious elements like Rosmer and Monat allow themselves to be influenced by Souvarine and go along with his drift, end quote. End footnote. Still negotiating his relationship with the Comintern, Souvarine continued to edit the Bulletin Communiste. Of course, Souvarine published documents of Trotsky, though most were those of the majority. At the same time, thanks to a deal with Jules Humbert Droz, Souvarine was surprisingly allowed to take on a special project criticizing the bourgeois press for the major communist newspaper, La Humanité. His biographer, Jean-Louis Panet, asks, quote, did he dream of preserving the French party in order to offer it as a base of support for Trotsky? Very likely, for he no longer believed in the virtues of the Bolshevik party, end quote. Jean-Louis Panet. Souvarine attended the 13th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in May 1924, and though he had no right to speak there, since he was not a member of that party, the chair, Karl Radek, nevertheless allowed Souvarine to have the floor because he was a leading figure in the Comintern. Souvarine denounced the campaign of, quote, Souvarine denounced the campaign of, quote, slanders and lies, end quote, being waged against Trotsky. When Souvarine finished, the majority delegates, furious at his speech, shouted, quote, shame on him, end quote. Trotsky spoke afterwards, but said not a word on behalf of Souvarine, the only person who had spoken on his behalf. There was an attempt by the French delegation of the 13th Congress of the Russian Communist Party to have Souvarine removed from his position in the Comintern. But Radek argued that since Souvarine held his position by virtue of being a French delegate to the Communist International, the Russian Party Congress could do nothing, and the motion was ruled out of order. A July meeting of a Comintern Special Commission on the, quote, Souvarine question, end quote, finally led to Souvarine's exclusion from the International. Following the Fifth Congress of the Communist International, at which Zinoviev and his supporters defeated Trotsky, Souvarine was also expelled, theoretically temporarily, by the French Communist Party, quote, accusing him of being an authoritarian autocrat infatuated with himself, end quote. Souvarine, end quote. Souvarine himself saw things differently, writing, quote, I was excluded from the Communist Party and from the Third International in 1925. That is, after the death of Lenin under the accusation of indiscipline and nonconformism, ... end quote. He attributed his exclusion to having, quote, opposed the campaign to denigrate Trotsky, end quote. Excluded from his own party, Souvarine now had no role in the International. Surprisingly, after his exclusion, he stayed on in Soviet Russia, only finally leaving and returning to France in 1925. Souvarine explained to Zinoviev, quote, what I disapprove of is the war being conducted against Comrade Trotsky and those who are suspected rightly or wrongly of being Trotskyists. It is not that I have become a Trotskyist, end quote. But he added, Trotsky's idea must be very good, for the Central Committee has adopted the essential ones. The principal idea of Trotsky that Souvarine supported was the democratization of the party to make possible a struggle against the bureaucracy that stood in the way of both international revolution and a more rapid industrialization. Because Souvarine had been a leader in both the French Communist Party and in the Communist International, and as one historian writes, quote, ... his defection in 1924 precipitated a chain reaction, end quote. One historian speculates that the explosion at the same time of Souvarine's popular revolutionary syndicalist allies, Alfred Rosmer and Pierre Monat, may have led as many as 100,000 militants to leave the party. Sorry. I lost my space. The mass resignations clearly reflected a more serious malaise in the communist movement. Some who left gravitated to a number of small communist opposition groups and publications, among them a half dozen Trotskyist groups. I want to look up those names because I'm going to assume some people don't know them. Alfred Rosmer was pretty important in the history of international Trotskyism because I think even after leaving the movement, he was like friends with Trotsky and allowed him to use his house for one of the early meetings of the Fourth International, or the groups that were preparatory to organizing the Fourth International. It says, the Wikipedia says, Alfred Rosmer was an American-born French communist, political activist, and historian who was a leading member of the Comintern. Rosmer is best remembered as a political associate of Leon Trotsky and as a memoirist. I think Pierre Monat was like a revolutionary syndicalist, like it was just said, like a trade union militant, something like that. Pierre Monat was a French trade unionist and founder of the Confédération Générale du Travail, CGT, General Confederation of Labor, at the beginning of the 20th century, and founder of its journal, La Vie Ouvrière, Worker's Life, on the 5th of October 1909. Monat has been considered one of the great figures of revolutionary syndicalism. Okay, just clarify some of those names. Because Souvarine had been a leader in both the French Communist Party and in the Communist International, and as one historian writes, quote, ... his defection in 1924 precipitated a chain reaction, end quote. Oh shit, I already said that. Forgive me. Okay. Souvarine and the opposition. Rosmer and Monat began to publish La Révolution Prolétarienne, for which Souvarine wrote anonymously using the pen name, quote, a communist, end quote. In October 1925, Souvarine also revived the Bulletin Communiste, now as a revolutionary socialist opposition journal. His slogan was, quote, excluded, but communists, end quote. In it, he published the official documents of the Communist International and Trotsky's articles, but concentrated on analyzing developments in the Soviet Union and in the French Communist Party. Small groups of militants, a few hundred here and there, were leaving the party, creating enough pressure that La Humanité had to open up its columns to the dissidents. Souvarine dreamed of recreating a real communist party. In December 1925, Souvarine wrote to ask the Comintern executive to reintegrate him, but it refused, accusing him of being a factionalist engaged in a counter-revolutionary campaign. Footnote. Despite Souvarine's expulsion from the communist movement, David Ryazanov employed him in following years to work in France for the Marx-Engels Institute, acquiring documents dealing with socialist history, such as papers of Gracchus Babeuf. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that right.
Gracchus Babeuf.
Babeuf.
Gracchus Babeuf.
He was like part of like the conspiracy of equals or whatever, right? Yeah, it says Gracchus Babeuf was a French proto-communist revolutionary and journalist of the French Revolutionary period. Babeuf's paper, the Tribune of the People, was best known for its advocacy for the poor and calling for a popular revolt against the Directory, the government of France. Babeuf was a leading advocate for democracy and the abolition of private property. Babeuf angered the authorities who were clamping down hard on their radical enemies. In spite of the efforts of his Jacobin friends to save him, Babeuf was executed for his role in the conspiracy of equals. The nickname Gracchus likened him to the Gracchi brothers, who served as tribunes of the people in ancient Rome. Although the terms anarchist, communist, and socialist were not largely used in Babeuf's time, they have been used by later scholars to describe his ideas. Communism was first used in English by John Goodwin Barmby in a conversation with those he described as, quote, the disciples of Babeuf, unquote. Babeuf has been called, quote, the first revolutionary communist, end quote. About his political philosophy, Babeuf wrote, quote, society must be made to operate in such a way that it eradicates once and for all the desire of a man to become richer or wiser or more powerful than others, end quote. In the manifesto of the Equals, Babeuf wrote, quote, the French Revolution was nothing but a precursor of another revolution, one that will be bigger, more solemn, and which will be the last, end quote. So, there we are. Where was I? I was like reading a reference to a thing in the footnote. Anyway, small groups of militants, I think I'm back, okay. Yeah, small groups of militants, a few hundred here and there, were leaving the party, creating enough pressure that La Humanité had to open up its columns to the dissidents. Souvarine dreamed of recreating a real communist party. In December 1925, he wrote to ask the Comintern executive to reintegrate him, but it refused, accusing Souvarine of being a factionalist engaged in a counter-revolutionary campaign. In 1926, Souvarine obtained a copy of Lenin's, quote, Testament and worked with Max Eastman and Alfred Rosmer to see it published. This is just the Wikipedia for Max Eastman. Max Forster Eastman was an American writer on literature, philosophy, and society, a poet, and a prominent political activist. You're very handsome, man. Look at this picture. Moving to New York City for graduate school, Eastman became involved with radical circles in Greenwich Village. Eastman supported socialism, became a leading patron of the Harlem Renaissance, and an activist for a number of liberal and radical causes. For several years, he edited The Masses. With his sister Crystal Eastman, he co-founded in 1917 The Liberator, a radical magazine of politics and the arts. While residing in the Soviet Union from the fall of 1922 to the summer of 1924, Eastman was influenced by the power struggle between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin and the events leading to Stalin's eventual seizure of power. As a witness to the Great Purge and the Soviet Union's totalitarianism, he became highly critical first of Stalinism and then of communism and socialism in general. While remaining atheist, he became an advocate of free market economics and anti-communism. In 1955, he published Reflections on the Failure of Socialism. Max Eastman published more frequently in National Review and other conservative journals in later life, but he always remained independent in his thinking. For instance, Eastman publicly opposed the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War in the 1960s earlier than most. So that's Max Eastman. In 1926, Souvarine obtained a copy of Lenin's, quote, Testament, end quote, and worked with Max Eastman and Alfred Rosemer to see it published. As Eastman, then also a Trotskyist, wrote, quote, I spent the best of 2 weeks always in co-conspiracy with Souvarine, composing and verifying it, end quote. Souvarine also helped Eastman with his book Since Lenin Died, which contained the text of the Testament. However, after it was published, Trotsky denied that any such testament existed and confessed to having violated party discipline. In a public letter regarding the book, Trotsky accused Eastman of, quote, pure slander against the Central Committee, end quote. As Eastman later wrote, he received, quote, the news that their effort failed the opposition led by Leon Trotsky had capitulated, confessed that they had done wrong to agitate against the Stalin regime, and promised never to do it again, end quote. Max Eastman. It was at this time that Souvarine, having quit his job with La Humanité, helped to found the Marx-Lenin Circle, bringing together a number of communist oppositionists with the goal of working to return the Communist International to, quote, normality, end quote. As his biographer, Jean-Louis Panay, writes, quote, the history of the Circle is essentially that of the French communist opposition, end quote. Among those who joined the Circle were a number of younger leftists, such as Gerard Rosenthal and Pierre Naville, who, after the break between Trotsky and Serge, would go off to found a new Trotskyist circle and publish La Vérité. I think Pierre Naville is associated with surrealism. Okay. Okay, there's something for Jerry Rosenthal on the internet. And for Pierre Naville, Pierre Naville was a French surrealist writer and sociologist. Pierre Naville was a prominent member of the, quote, investigating sex, end quote, group of surrealist thinkers. In politics, Naville was a communist and then a Trotskyist before joining the PSU. He led a career as an occupational sociologist. Anyway, new section. Souvarine's writings, 1925 to 1928. In his own analytical articles before 1929, Souvarine generally took positions in line with those of Trotsky, arguing that the opposition should base itself on the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. He expressed concerns about the impact of the new economic policy on the Soviet Union, and also criticized the bureaucracy and lack of democracy, particularly the appointment or co-optation rather than election of the Communist Party, Comintern, and Soviet government leaders and representatives. He was a fierce critic of Zinovьev's campaign of Bolshevization, which he interpreted as a bureaucratization of the Communist International and the national communist parties, leading to structures and practices comparable to the bureaucratic social democratic parties. Souvarine criticized the Communist Party's growing repression of critics and dissidents, which had driven the Russian opposition underground. In articles in La Révolution Prolétarienne, written in August 1926, Souvarine praised Trotsky, saying that all real communists would rally to Trotsky's program of industrialization and democratization. Souvarine was also concerned about Moscow's domination of other communist parties and naturally most worried about his own French Communist Party. In 1927, in a confidential letter to the Russian opposition, circulated to his closest comrades, Souvarine strongly criticized Moscow's financial subsidies to the national communist parties using France, which he knew best, as his principal example. He argued that Moscow's enormous financial subventions of millions of francs, more than 20 times the value of members' dues, had strengthened the International's control over the party and the party's bureaucratic tendencies, leading to widespread corruption. Moscow, he argued, gave its money to the favored leaders of party, who supported the dominant Russian faction, which also ensured their subordination and loyalty to the Communist International and to the Russian Communist Party. Souvarine argued that this in turn had brought about, quote, the intellectual decline and the moral abasement of our parties, end quote. Boris Souvarine. During the late 1920s, Souvarine's articles became increasingly critical of the Russian Communist Party. In his article, On the Eve of the Storm, Where is the Russian Revolution Going?, published in 1926, Souvarine wrote, quote, Since the death of Lenin, there has been no debate in the party, end quote. He believed, he wrote, that, quote, the bureaucracy can only rule through a state of siege, end quote, end quote. At that time, like Trotsky, Souvarine attributed the corruption of the party to the growth of rich peasants and of a new small and large bourgeoisie connected to the innumerable functionaries of a privileged elite who were party profiteers. The principal answer to these problems, he believed, was, quote, to accelerate industrialization, end quote, which was Trotsky's program. He wrote prophetically it would turn out, quote, the omnipotent fraction seems to want to provoke a civil war, end quote. Souvarine's essay, The Defeat of the Revolution, published in La Révolution Prolétarienne at the end of November 1926, after the 15th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, reminds us of Victor Serge's From Lenin to Stalin, which was published a decade later. Souvarine described the moral and political degeneration of the life of the Bolshevik Party, now run by a, quote, small clan, end quote, quote, an omnipotent fraction, end quote. Souvarine wrote that the opposition, quote, denied all rights to exist, could only choose between insurrection and submission. The opposition submits without giving up its opinions to avoid shedding blood, end quote. Opposition members are forced to sign loyalty oaths to a party, quote, where all discussion is forbidden, end quote. He concluded, quote, the balance is, there are only the defeated, end quote. At one time, Souvarine wrote, the party could have attempted to regain its vigor by serving the interests of the working class, but no longer. Quote, today, there are new caste interests of the Soviet bureaucracy, opposed to those of the working class. One can no longer serve the one without doing a disservice to the other, end quote. He reported that when the opposition had attempted to speak out, the party paper Pravda published dozens of statements calling for crushing the splitters, creating, quote, the atmosphere of a pogrom, end quote. Souvarine notes that, quote, these methods imitated Italian fascism, end quote. Souvarine ended the essay placing his hope in the working class, but after his description of the problems, particularly the, quote, caste interest, end quote, of the bureaucracy, the reader is not convinced that there is a way out. A turning point in Souvarine's view comes with his powerful essay, Black October, published in the Bulletin Communiste of October November 1927. I have a part of that essay that I got from the website, from the magazine Data Side, which is a great resource for interesting articles, and not only like original articles, but also curates past pieces. And this is one of them, called the Black October essay. The essay began by describing the Soviet economy and class structure, noting that while pre-war levels of production had been achieved, still, accepting the elimination of the nobility, the balance, that is, the relative weight of the social classes, had not changed much, except for the growth of the NEP-men, the NEP men, merchants, and the, quote, monstrous, end quote, expansion of the bureaucracy. If you don't know who the NEP-men are, NEP men. NEP-men were business people in the early Soviet Union who took advantage of the opportunities for private trade and small-scale manufacturing provided under the new economic policy that existed from 1921 to 1928. The famine of 1921 to 1922 epitomized the adverse effects of war communism, and to mitigate those effects, Vladimir Lenin instituted the NEP, which encouraged private buying and selling, with people even being encouraged to, quote, enrich yourselves, end quote, as one Bolshevik leader, Nikolai Bukharin, put it. However, many Bolsheviks saw the policy as, quote, a step backwards, end quote. That included Lenin himself, who defended the measure as, quote, taking one step backward to take two steps forward later on, end quote. The biggest group of the 3 million or so NEP men were engaged in handicrafts in the countryside, but those who traded or ran small businesses in the cities faced the most negative attitudes, especially because some amassed considerable fortunes. One of the main objectives of the Communist Party was to promote socialism, and the capitalist behavior of the NEP-men challenged that goal. However, given the economic benefits that NEP-men provided, the government allowed their existence. As they gained a better standard of living compared to their poor working-class counterparts, the NEP-men became reviled and stereotyped as greedy. Among ordinary folk, traditional hatred of profiteers found focus in the NEP-men, some of it acquiring an anti-Semitic tinge. This was reinforced by the official media representation of NEP-men as vulgar nouveau riche, new rich. As Joseph Stalin consolidated his power, he moved aggressively to end the NEP and to put NEP-men out of business, eventually abolishing private commerce in 1931. Back to the text. Souvarine discussed the many problems of the economy, such as low productivity and low quality, and the general chaotic character of it all. Souvarine noted a tendency toward the restoration of the old social classes, except the aristocracy, which has been destroyed. But the real subject of the essay was, quote, the degeneration of Bolshevism, end quote. Souvarine noted that, quote, in the course of 6 years, the party is profoundly changed in its composition as well as in its ideology, end quote. Souvarine's critique of the Communist Party represented a new analysis for Souvarine and for the opposition. As Souvarine wrote, quote, the party forms a new privileged class, ... end quote. The party has, quote, ... a monopoly of political activity. The party is not a fraction of the proletariat. The party is above. The party's interests are no longer identified with those of the class. There is the party, and there is the rest, end quote. Souvarine's analysis does not say so, but it suggests that the future of the revolution and of the communist movement must lie outside of and against the party. In Black October, Souvarine also argued that the opposition shared responsibility with the majority for developments in the Soviet Union. The opposition structure was identical with that of the majority. Quote, the opposition, however, did not understand the transformation, and it also remained foreign to the mass. it too entertained party fetishism. For a long time, now it has been incapable of going back to its communist origins. It has had, it too, its aristocrats in the embassies and the superior economic or administrative organs, its proletariat in the factories, its interior regime with leaders who are the depositories of all knowledge, of all authority, and its followers. End quote. Souvarine thought that Trotsky had made a mistake in asserting his loyalty to the party. Souvarine quoted Trotsky speaking at the 13th Congress in May of 1924, quote, "None of us desires or is able to dispute the will of the party. Clearly the party is always right, ... We can only be right with and by the party, for history has provided no other way of being in the right. The English have a saying, quote, 'My country, right or wrong,' end quote. Whether it is in the right or in the wrong, it is my country. We have much better historical justification in saying whether it is right or wrong in certain individual concrete cases. It is my party, ... And if the party adopts a decision which one or other of us thinks unjust, he will say, just or unjust, it is my party, and I shall support the consequences of the decision to the end." End quote. Footnote. Souvarine gives a shortened version of Trotsky's remarks, while I have given the full quotation here. So, end quote, Trotsky. Souvarine went on to say, quote, "Yes, on an abstract theoretical level, but if the historical conditions of the time, of the social milieu, of the political culture have turned the party into a sort of distinct social class." End quote. Clearly, if this is the case, then one cannot base one's strategy on attempting to work within the party. Souvarine believed that the opposition should give up the use of the terms, quote, "Leninism" and, quote, "Bolshevism." Souvarine argued that, quote, "Leninism," end quote, had become a, quote, "new official ideology," end quote, quote, "a dogma," end quote, quote, "a religion," end quote. Souvarine declared that, quote, "within the complexus of Leninism there is a particular poison. It's immoralism, ... end quote. By this, Souvarine meant a, quote, "end justifies the means," quote, "ends justify the man's morality," end quote. I think it's supposed to say means. Anyway, by this, Souvarine meant a, quote, "ends justify the means morality," end quote, even though one has lost sight of the ends. And on the question of Leninism, quote, "the opposition has descended to the level of its adversaries," end quote. Souvarine believed that the demand for democracy must apply not only to the party, but also to the Soviets and the labor unions. As Souvarine wrote, quote, "For a long time, the opposition, end bracket, has only talked about, quote, democracy in the party, and given the distinction already understood between the party and the proletariat, this renders its demand indifferent to the masses. Until its last, quote, platform," end quote, it did not understand this to include the labor unions or the Soviets. It has given the impression of only wanting to supplant the masters who hold power and of not having dream of democracy to achieve this, an impression unfortunately confirmed by the competition of a Democrat such as Zinoviev," end quote. Souvarine. Toward the conclusion of Black October, Souvarine returned to his earlier point about the character of the party, now expanding that analysis to take in the character of the state, writing, quote, "Just as the state, the instrument of the ruling classes, acquires little by little distinct interest, so the dictatorship of the Soviet patriciate ends up finding in itself its raison d'etre, opposed to the progress of proletariat institutions." I think that might be raison d'etre.
Raison d'être. Raison d'être.
Raison d'être, which means purpose, if you didn't know. I'm going to reread that just because I feel like I fucked it up. Quote, just as the state, the instrument of the ruling classes, acquires little by little distinct interests, so the dictatorship of the Soviet patriciate ends up finding in itself its raison d'être, opposed to the progress of proletarian institutions, end quote. Souvarine's final point dealt with the policy of the communists vis-a-vis the working class movements. He wrote that the majority and the opposition had rivaled each other in, quote, pseudo-leftism, end quote, and they think of, quote, the United Front as some clever ploy, end quote. Souvarine criticized the arrogance of the opposition, writing, quote, it is the struggle of the international communist minority against the whole working class of two worlds. Sorry, there's a typo here. Souvarine criticized the arrogance of the opposition, writing, quote, it is the struggle of the international communist minority against the whole working class of two world on the pretext of combating its errors and its, quote, leaders, end quote. As if the role of a vanguard, which is what it pretends to be, is to fire upon the entire army, end quote. Towards the end of the essay, Souvarine wrote, quote, in all of this, the opposition and the majority share responsibility. The greatest service to be rendered to them is to criticize them mercilessly, end quote. Still, he concluded, the opposition was better than the majority because it calls for democracy, for internationalism, for industrialization, for economic planning, all with a working class character. Trotsky himself had, beginning with the new course, made many similar criticisms of the Soviet bureaucracy and the Communist Party. But Souvarine went further when he asked, quote, but if the historical conditions of the time, of the social milieu, of the political culture, have turned the party into a sort of distinct social class, end quote. And pretty clearly he thought that the answer was that it had, and that therefore the party could not be the vehicle to save socialism in the Soviet Union. The Trotsky-Souvarine controversy. Leon Trotsky recognized Souvarine as part of the opposition, broadly speaking, and as a talented person whom he wished to recruit to his camp. While Boris Souvarine had long identified with Leon Trotsky's political views, in the late 1920s their opinions began to diverge, and in 1929 their differences led to a sharp debate and finally a break between the two men. A series of pointed letters between them, which is sometimes called the Trotsky-Souvarine controversy, shows Souvarine developed a critique of Trotsky's views, methods, and leadership that anticipates Victor Serge's critique by about a decade later. We must put this controversy in context so that we don't anachronistically bring to it what the Soviet Union later became. Trotsky's position before 1929. Trotsky was the principal author of the platform of the Joint or United Opposition that had been created in 1925 as a result of the merger of the Trotskyist left opposition with the new opposition group of Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. The United Opposition platform, published in 1927, took the view that the struggle in the Soviet Union was chiefly a fight of the working class against capitalism. As the introduction to the program said, quote, the capitalist element finds its primary expression in a class differentiation in the country and in a multiplication of private traders in the city. The upper levels in the country and the bourgeois elements in the city are interweaving themselves more and more closely with the various links of our state economic apparatus. And this apparatus not infrequently helps the new bourgeoisie to wrap up in a statistical fog its successful effort to increase its share in the national income, end quote. Platform of the Joint Opposition. Leon Trotsky. It says in the footnotes it's available at Marxist.org if you're interested. Trotsky believed that these forces found expression in the factions of the Communist Party and saw the principal danger in the right tendency within the Communist Party led by Nikolai Bukharin, while seeing Stalin's center faction as representing a wavering centrist group. The Stalin group, he wrote, quote, moves in zigzags, accommodating itself to and ingratiating itself with hostile elements, end quote. Trotsky believed that the problem with the role of the Soviets, believed that the problem Sorry, there's a typo here, I think. Trotsky believed that the problem with role of Soviets was capitalism, quote, the penetration of the Soviets by the lower kulak and, quote, semi-kulak, end quote, element and the town bourgeoisie, which began in 1925, was partially stopped by the attacks of the opposition, is a very deep political process, to ignore or conceal which would threaten the proletarian dictatorship with very dire consequences, end quote. Trotsky. In the conclusion to the United Opposition platform, of which he was the principal author, Trotsky wrote, quote, in contending for a definite tempo of industrialization as the premise of our socialist construction, in contending against the growth of the kulak and the kulak's aspiration towards supremacy in the countryside, in contending for a timely improvement of the living conditions of the workers, for democracy within the party, the trade unions and the Soviets, the opposition contends not for ideas which might bring about a separation of the working class from its party, but on the contrary for a reinforcement of the foundations of a real unity in the all-union Communist Party, end quote. That's Trotsky in Chapter 12 of the platform of the joint opposition against opportunism for the United Party. Thus, the United Opposition's program can be summed up as industrialization plus democratization. The commitment to remain in the party and to restrict the struggle against Stalin principally to the parameters of the party frustrated the efforts of the United Opposition, since Stalin controlled the leadership and the, quote, Lenin levy of 1923 to 25, and had brought approximately 500,000 new members into the party. Universally described as largely apolitical, opportunistic, docile, and easily manipulated. The Lenin levy is, according to Wikipedia, my understanding, it's like the mass enrollment of trying to get a lot of people in the into the Communist Party that weren't already in it. But let's see what Wikipedia says. The Lenin enrollment, or Lenin's call to the party, the Lenin levy, after Vladimir Lenin, was an effort from 1923 to 1925 to enroll more members of the proletariat into the Communist Party and incite them to become active in party affairs. In total, over 500,000 were recruited. It came in response to growing criticism of the Communist Party as elitist by the rank and file. Even though the party claimed to represent the working class, most of its membership, and particularly its leadership, including Lenin himself, came from the educated classes. The criticism reached a peak at the 10th Party Congress in 1920. That's an error. The 10th Party Congress is in 1921. When the, quote, workers' opposition, end quote, openly challenged Lenin. Even though Lenin managed to put down the rebellion within party ranks that time, the pressure to make the party more representative of its supposed base could no longer be ignored. So, there you are. Back to the text. Under tremendous pressure, many of the United Opposition leaders of all subgroups capitulated to Stalin. When in November 1927, the United Opposition attempted to actually take their case to the workers, the Stalinists organized the reception, and they were jeered. Stalin, however, had already taken control of the Communist Party and through the party of industry, agriculture, the Soviets, and labor unions. All of this stifled the opposition, in large part because Stalin had adopted some of the opposition's positions, while leaders of the united opposition had capitulated and gone over to Stalin. Still, Trotsky, as he wrote in The Defense of the Soviet Union and the Opposition in September 1929, believed that the situation was not hopeless. Quote, the fact that the Soviet proletariat found it beyond its strength to prevent the organizational crushing of the opposition represented naturally a highly alarming symptom. But on the other hand, Stalin found himself driven simultaneously with the crushing of the left opposition to plagiarize partially from the left opposition's program in all fields, to direct his fire to the right, and to convert an internal party maneuver into a very sharp and prolonged zigzag to the left. This shows that despite everything that the proletariat still possesses powers to exert pressure, and that the state apparatus still remains dependent on it. Upon this cardinal fact, the Russian opposition must continue to base its own policy, which is the policy of reform and not of revolution, end quote. Trotsky. The Defense of the Soviet Union and the Opposition, September 1929. Trotsky believed that Stalin and his centrist faction were despite themselves defending the gains of the revolution, as Trotsky wrote, quote, but what is Soviet centrism defending? It is defending the social system that originated from the political and economic expropriation of the bourgeoisie. Soviet centrism defends the social system very poorly, very unskillfully, arousing distrust and disillusionment among the proletariat, which does not, unfortunately, dispose of the same experience as the British bourgeoisie. It weakens the dictatorship, helps the forces of Thermidor, and because of the objective situation, Stalinist centrism nevertheless represents a proletarian and not an imperialist regime, end quote. Trotsky, The Defense of the Soviet Union and the Opposition, September 1929. The key element for Trotsky is the state has nationalized private property, as he says, quote, the most important means of production conquered by the proletariat on November 7, 1917, still remains in the hands of the workers' state, end quote. Against the Stalinist center, Trotsky called for democratization, quote, in the struggle against Stalinist bureaucratism, which expresses and facilitates the pressure of enemy classes, the Russian opposition demands democracy in the party, the trade unions, and the Soviets on a proletarian basis, end quote, Trotsky writes. Yet Trotsky opposed the German left opposition leader Hugo Urbans, who called for, quote, freedom to organize, end quote, in the Soviet Union. Quote, it is not a question of winning the, quote, freedom to organize, end quote, against a hostile class government, but of struggling for a regime under which the trade unions will enjoy, within the framework of the dictatorship, the necessary freedom to correct their own state by words and deeds, ... Urbans would be absolutely correct on one trifling condition, namely, if one recognizes that Thermidor is accomplished, ... But for the opposition, the struggle for party democracy has meaning only on the basis of the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It would be quixotic, not to say idiotic, to fight for democracy in a party which is realizing the rule of a class hostile to us, end quote. Trotsky, Defense of the Soviet Union and of the Opposition, September 1929. Trotsky concluded his article this way, quote, it is necessary to adopt the position of the most resolute and unconditional defense of the USSR against external dangers, which does not include, but on the contrary presupposes an irreconcilable struggle against Stalinism in time of war even more so than in time of peace. It is necessary to reject and condemn the program of struggle for, quote, the freedom to organize, end quote, and all other, quote, freedoms, end quote, in the USSR, because this is the program of bourgeois democracy. To this program of bourgeois democracy, we must counterpose the slogans and methods of proletarian democracy, whose aim in the struggle against bureaucratic centrism is to regenerate and fortify the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. The views expressed in these writings of Trotsky provide the immediate background to his debate with Souvarine. New section. Trotsky and Souvarine clash. At the time of their exchanges, Trotsky, who had been expelled from the Soviet Communist Party in November of 1927 and subsequently deported from the Soviet Union, was living in exile on the island of Principe near Istanbul, while Souvarine was in Paris. The controversy collection, 104 pages, involves the 5 short documents from Trotsky and one very long letter. 70 printed pages from Souvarine. Let's turn to the debate. The international question was of supreme importance for Trotsky in this period. In 1928, while in internal exile in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, Trotsky had written for the Sixth Congress of the Communist International, the draft program of the Communist International, a criticism of fundamentals, later published as part of the book Third International After Lenin. It says here that, in a footnote, it says, an English version of Souvarine's long letter can be found in Revolutionary History, Volume 2, Number 1, titled Trotsky and His Critics. And some of this other stuff that I'm mentioning is all found on Marxist.org. The Third International After Lenin is on Marxist.org, and so is A Letter to Souvarine. Anyway, back to the text. As Trotsky wrote in the introduction to the Third International After Lenin, quote, the Stalin group has taken off the order of the day of our whole epoch. The very concept of the International Socialist Revolution, end quote. It is not surprising, then, that in his letter of April 25, 1929, to his, quote, esteemed comrade, end quote, Souvarine, Trotsky argued that the immediate central issue facing the communist movement were the problems of the Soviet Union's international policies, the communist attitude towards the Chinese Revolution and the Anglo-Russian Committee, though he also fiercely criticized the German communists Heinrich Brandler and August Thalheimer, both of whom had been involved in the so-called right opposition identified with Nikolai Bukharin, though at this point, Bukharin having been defeated in the Central Committee in April 1929, the German opposition now gave lip service to support for Stalin. Some of the letter, however, dealt with the Soviet Union and particularly the question of agriculture and the peasantry. Trotsky declared that the key problem in Soviet Russia, the problem that explained the tendency toward counter-revolution, was the issue of the kulak. Quote, the middle peasantry is a social protoplasm. The middle peasantry develops invariably and uninterruptedly in 2 directions, toward capitalism, through the kulaks, and toward socialism, through the semi-proletarian and agricultural laborers, ... The problem of Thermidor and Bonapartism is at bottom the problem of the kulak, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky believed that the Soviet bureaucracy's, quote, duality, end quote, resulted from the fact that the Soviet bureaucracy, quote, zigzagged amidst the classes, end quote. Trotsky believed that the Soviet Union would either return to capitalism if the kulaks and other small and large capitalists became a factor in the economy, or towards socialism if industrialization, accompanied by a gradual democratization, increased the weight of the working class in the society. Trotsky called for a reorientation of the party by means of the, quote, secret vote, end quote, first in the Communist Party, then afterwards in the labor unions, and then perhaps later in the Soviets. At least in these letters, Trotsky did not touch on the question of the right to organize factions within the Communist Party or the right to multi-party democracy, which would also have required the right to freedom of the press, rights to assembly, and to free speech. In another letter to Souvarine on June 12, 1929, Trotsky again took up the issue of Brandler and Thalheimer, declaring that whatever the complications in the German situation, quote, this in no way means that the democratic regime of the Communist Party should assure citizen rights to the opportunist tendency of Brandler. One can't consider democracy in the party as a thing in itself. We speak of democracy based on determined revolutionary positions that exclude Brandlerism. end quote. Trotsky. Letter to Boris Souvarine. That is, Trotsky and his united opposition supporters, who had been excluded from, quote, citizenship, end quote, in the Communist International, would also see the right opposition excluded. Trotsky, however, had not called for the exclusion of the Stalinist center, since, as Trotsky had written, Trotsky believed under pressure from the working class the center defended the non-capitalist Soviet economic system. Footnote. There is an additional irony here, which is that while Stalin and the Communist International had proclaimed the Social Democrats to be, quote, social fascists, end quote, and refused any alliance with them, Thalheimer and Brandler's Communist Party Opposition of Germany, KPO, would in June of 1932 call for a, quote, united front, end quote, between socialists and communists, the Socialist Workers' Party, SAP, and the labor unions in Germany, which was Trotsky's position. See Robert J. Alexander's The Right Opposition, the Lovestonites, and the International Communist Opposition of the 1930s, and Trotsky's For a United Front Against Fascism, December 1931. End footnote. In that period, Trotsky recognized the weakness of, quote, revolutionary Marxists, end quote, made it impossible, the weakness of, quote, revolutionary Marxists, end quote, made it impossible to build mass parties and had reduced them to creating an international propaganda society. But Trotsky argued that, quote, we, the vanguard of the vanguard, end quote, with the advantage of a more, quote, mature, end quote, situation, quote, we are more, quote, mature, end quote, based on the experience of Marx, Lenin, and others, end quote. And Trotsky calls for the greatest, quote, intransigence even fiercer than that of Lenin at the beginning of the imperialist war, end quote. Yes, he says, the Philistines will call us, quote, sectarian, end quote, but real revolutionaries should see that as the greatest honor. Reading this letter, one feels that we see emerging, if not Trotsky's full political analysis, certainly the posture and attitude toward the left and labor that will characterize him and his followers into the future. New section. Souvarine's response. Souvarine's response to Trotsky's letters is a long, detailed, and complicated response in which he challenges the latter's views on the method of Marxist analysis, the character of the Soviet economy, the strategy of the United Front, the role of the International, and the question of democracy in the Soviet Union and Trotsky's leadership. Souvarine begins with a discussion of Marxism, its relation to Bolshevism. Souvarine writes, quote, Bolshevism was Marxism simplified for use in a country in which classes were well defined and in which the revolution was permanently on the agenda. On the level of social science, Bolshevism represented an impoverished Marxism, whereas regards practical activity, Bolshevism was in line with the needs of Bolshevism's time and place. End quote. Souvarine. Letter to Leon Trotsky. Titled, available in Revolutionary History, Volume 2, Number 1, titled Trotsky and His Critics. End footnote. After Lenin's death, wrote Souvarine, Bolshevism was even further simplified in what came to be called, quote, Leninism, end quote. Quote, Leninism is a mystique armed with deterministic phraseology, which lives in Lenin's ashes after having choked off Lenin's flame, ... end quote. Souvarine. Souvarine made clear that he thinks it is a mistake that Trotsky and the opposition call themselves, quote, Leninists or, quote, Bolshevik, given that the Stalinist Communist International also uses those terms. Useful for making the revolution, quote, Bolshevism showed itself not up to the task during the period of peaceful reconstruction. The recovery of Russian production was undertaken by means of a state capitalism, in which a new social layer appropriated and a consumer a great part of the surplus value. I I think there's a typo here. The recovery of Russian production was undertaken by means of a state capitalism in which a new social layer appropriated and consumed a great part of the surplus value produced by the wage earners, end quote. Souvarine. Souvarine's characterization of the Soviet Union as state capitalist and dominated by a new social layer is at odds with Trotsky's view that the Soviet Union remained a worker state, though with bureaucratic deformations. Souvarine contended that the Communist International's extension of Bolshevism to Europe and Asia had been a complete failure. Quote, Bolshevism had failed outside Russia not only by ignoring the relationship of forces. Bolshevism had not grasped the nature of the epoch. Bolshevism does not know how to analyze the conditions of capitalism, has badly underestimated the ruling class's means of resistance, has overestimated the consciousness and combativity of the exploited classes, and has made the fatal mistake of wanting to create communist parties in its own image, end quote. Souvarine listed the Comintern's failures. Finland, Hungary, Bavaria, Bulgaria, Estonia, and China. Oddly enough, Souvarine does not include Germany in his list. While, as Souvarine had said earlier, he supported the Comintern's first 4 congresses, Souvarine opposed the manner in which the Comintern had intervened in other communist parties. Souvarine criticized the Communist International for its attempt to manage revolutions in a variety of nations, generally without sufficient knowledge and often overriding the local political leadership. Souvarine criticized both the Stalinist majority and the opposition, both of which, quote, want to impose a Russian leadership upon a Chinese movement, end quote. Souvarine argued that, on the contrary, quote, the revolution in China has to be Chinese, and the emancipation of the Chinese workers will be the work of the Chinese workers themselves. The socialist and communist parties of the world, the internationals and the Soviet state, must provide them with help and solidarity, advice and discussion, but should not seek to take over the movement, end quote. Boris Souvarine. Souvarine had turned to Trotsky's method of dealing with his critics, particularly his tendency to directly and immediately identify political currents with social classes. If someone raises Souvarine then turned to Trotsky's method of dealing with Trotsky's critics, particularly Trotsky's tendency to directly and immediately identify political currents with social classes. This is early, but this is absolutely, from my opinion, is absolutely true. If you read and I'm currently reading the book In Defense of Marxism, which is like a compilation of Trotsky's criticisms, but more likely just like condemnations of the minority position oriented around Shachtman, Burnham, and Aborn. The whole thing is trying to say oh, this is like a foreign petty bourgeois element that's not actually proletarian or whatever. Anyway, there's a typo here, I think. I'm going to try to make sense of this sentence. If someone raises ideas that Trotsky thinks are, quote, rightist, end quote, then the person represents the capitalist class. Quote, do ideas have to be rigorously automatic emanations of states, class, relations, and shifts, end quote? Souvarine accuses Trotsky of caricaturing his opponents, labeling them on the, quote, right or, quote, quote, opportunist, end quote, or, quote, centrist, end quote, but in any case, quote, capitalist, end quote, and usually without providing any actual political analysis. I think that is right there is fucking spot on, dude. Basically, and this, he's talking about this in the 1920s, which I'm less familiar with, but reading Trotsky's works, which I've been doing, there's been a lot of Trotsky videos put up on the channel, is that this is absolutely true, is that it seems like the bulk of In Defense of Marxism is just like saying, instead of like really like coming into like a serious debate with these people, he basically just mocks them for being for thinking outside the box, more or less. Like from my view at least, thinking more like outside the box, thinking like questioning the degenerated worker state thesis, questioning the progressive nature of Stalinism in spite itself. Like those kind of, his critiques are just basically, yeah, these are a bunch of like, I don't know, middle class New Yorkers who, they just don't represent the actual proletarian element, as if like the critique of capitalism represented by Marx or whoever, especially in the critique of political economy, his scientific work emerged from like I don't know, like it's just like so like I feel like that kind of like it's kind of like a Marxist identity politics of like the worst order, which is usually associated with new social movements, the kind of like, oh, you can only speak from your position of positionality or something like that, or like, I don't know, something like some kind of thing like that. But the whole like this whole thing is just kind of like trying to create like embarrassment for this tendency by like trying to like say, well, here's the actual class interests that they represent, as if you can kind of like create like, I don't know, one-to-one like there's some kind of direct bridge between someone's class position and their political values. Like I'm very, very like does a Stalinist working class person represent the true interests of the working class more so than someone than an intellectual who studies social science and history and has values that align with communist politics? Like who's more representative of like the true authentic proletarian position? Like, I don't know, it's weird. But yeah, yeah. I'm just gonna repeat that sentence. Sorry, I'm not really putting together any coherent thought here. I'm just saying that like, I think that Souvarine is right in that last sentence. But I'll reread it again and then just keep reading. Souvarine accuses Trotsky of caricaturing his opponents, labeling them on, quote, the right, or, quote, opportunist, or, quote, centrist, but in any case, quote, capitalist, and usually without providing an actual political analysis. Souvarine suggests that Trotsky used these terms simply to dismiss for those who disagreed with him. To make his point, Souvarine looked at the history of the Russian socialist movement and showed that left and right are often relative terms. In the debate over the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, for example, he reminds Trotsky that Bukharin was on the, quote, left and Lenin on the, quote, right. I'm just going to read the Wikipedia real quick on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is a separate peace treaty signed on the 3rd of March 1918 between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, by which Russia withdrew from World War I. The treaty, which followed months of negotiations after the armistice on the Eastern Front in December 1917, was signed at Brest-Litovsk, now Brest, Belarus. The Soviet delegation was initially headed by Adolf Joffe, and key figures of the Central Powers, including Max Hoffmann and Richard von Kuhlmann of Germany, Ottokar Czernin of Austria-Hungary, and Talat Pasha of the Ottoman Empire. In January 1918, the Central Powers demanded secession of all occupied territories of the former Russian Empire. The Soviets sent a new peace delegation led by Leon Trotsky, which aimed to stall the negotiations while awaiting revolutions in Central Europe. A renewed Central Powers offensive launched on February 18th forced the Soviet side to sue for peace. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia lost control of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, its Baltic provinces, now Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and its Caucasus provinces of Kars and Batum. The lands comprised 34% of the former empire's population, 54% of its industrial land, 89% of its coal fields, and 26% of its railways. The Soviet government also confirmed the independence of Poland, which it had recognized in January 1918, and pledged to end its war with the Ukrainian People's Republic, which the Central Powers had recognized under the prior Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 9th February 1918. A supplementary protocol signed in August 1918 required Russia to pay Germany war reparations of 6 million marks. The treaty was controversial in Russia, giving a unifying cause to the White Movement and opening a rift between the Bolsheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries, whose representatives withdrew from the Council of People's Commissars after its signing and later rebelled in the Left SR uprising. The treaty was annulled by the armistice of 11th of November 1918, in which Germany surrendered to the Western Allied powers. Subsequent attempts by the Soviets to restore power in the lost territories during the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, had mixed results, with the Red Army being defeated in the independence wars of the three Baltic countries in the Polish-Soviet War, but achieving victory in its invasion of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, and in the Ukrainian-Soviet War. The border with Turkey established by the treaty was largely affirmed by the Treaty of Kars, 1921. Under the Treaty of Rapallo, 1922, Russia and Germany renounced all territorial and financial claims against each other. The Russian borders established by the treaty bear an almost exact similarity to the post-1991 borders established after the fall of the Soviet Union. Sorry about that. That was rather long. Yeah. So back to the text. Just for those people who, and including myself, who need to brush up on the events of Brest-Litovsk. Souvarine suggested that Trotsky used these terms simply to dismiss those who disagreed with him. To make his point, Souvarine looked at the history of the Russian socialist movement and showed that left and right are often relative terms. In the debate over the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, for example, he reminds Trotsky that Bukharin was on the, quote, left and Lenin on the, quote, right. Did that, he asked, then make Lenin a tool of German imperialism or of Russian reactionaries? Trotsky often says that one is on one side of the barricades or the other, but then often creates three positions, left, right, and center. But then often creates three positions, left, right, and center, which leads Souvarine to ask how there can be three-sided barricades. That's funny. It is not only Trotsky's dismissive caricature of his opponents that Souvarine finds a problem, but also the Russian leader's view that he alone is capable of analyzing the world's situation. While respecting Trotsky's unique abilities and experience, Souvarine writes, quote, "In the modern world, there is no encyclopedic brain capable of taking in all of the vital questions. Specialization, connected with general knowledge, becomes as necessary in politics as in production. The advantage of having an international collectivity is rightly to associate competences whose equivalent does not exist inside one head alone." End quote. As an example of the problems generated by Trotsky's intellectual hubris, Souvarine points to his 1925 book, Where is Britain Going? Souvarine argues that Trotsky failed to understand the British economic situation, the consciousness of the working class, the nature of the labor unions and their leaders and the relations between them. Quote, "You believe that the British industrial crisis was opening up a revolutionary period. You deceived yourselves." End quote. Souvarine suggested that Trotsky had an overly mechanical notion of how economic crisis would lead to changes in workers' consciousness in Britain. An economic crisis does not lead automatically to a radicalized worker consciousness and then to revolution. Souvarine ridiculed Trotsky for his tendency to simply denigrate and dismiss his political opponents rather than analyzing and criticizing their arguments. Trotsky writes that in Trotsky's motion on the Anglo-Russian Committee, which dealt with the Labor Party, quote, I counted the words, quote, traitors and, quote, betrayal 25 times, without taking account of, quote, felony, quote, perfidy, and other expressions, end quote. What's perfidy mean? I don't know that word. Perfidy.
Perfidy.
Perfidy. Deceitfulness and untrustworthiness. Deceitfulness, untrustworthiness. Souvarine writes that in Souvarine writes that in Trotsky's motion on the Anglo-Russian Committee, which dealt with the Labor Party, quote, I counted the words, quote, traitors and, quote, betrayal 25 times without taking account of, quote, felony, quote, perfidy, and other expressions, end quote. Souvarine relates this to the way that both the Stalinist majority and the Trotskyists deal with the United Front. Not entering into an alliance with other workers' organizations and criticizing their views, but often simply condemning their leadership. Quote, you think it is sufficient to denounce the leaders in order to win over their troops. The leaders are contemptuous of your insults, and the troops do not want to hear them anymore. End quote. Turning to the question of the Soviet Union, Souvarine supported Trotsky's call for industrialization, but he disagreed fundamentally with what Trotsky described as the basis of his entire economic and political analysis, the kulak question, which is a linchpin of Trotsky's theory at that moment. Souvarine wrote, quote, you write that, quote, the middle peasantry is a social protoplasm, invariably and constantly taking form in two directions, capitalists by means of the kulaks and socialists by means of the semi-proletarians and laborers, end quote. It is an old Marxist hypothesis that history has not confirmed. You write about this in too simple and absolute a manner. In bourgeois countries, the concentration of capital and the proletarianization of labor didn't take in the countryside the expected route. Statistics, economic science, and experience testify to this. It is formed into small and medium rural property that doesn't evolve in the capitalist direction with the kulaks, nor in the socialist direction with the semi-proletarians and laborers. Of course, it's not a question of claiming that this kind of rural production will exist forever, but it is obvious that it can exist for a certain stage of the evolution of humanity, corresponding to a given technology and market conditions, end quote. That seems like a very important passage. I'm going to reread that, actually. Sorry. Quote, you write that the, quote, middle peasantry is a social protoplasm, invariably and constantly taking form in two directions, capitalists by means of the kulaks and socialists by means of the semi-proletarians and laborers, end quote. It is an old Marxist hypothesis that history has not confirmed. You write about this in too simple and absolute a manner. In bourgeois countries, the concentration of capital and the proletarianization of labor didn't take in the countryside the expected route. Statistics, economic science, and experience testify to this. It is formed into small and medium rural property that doesn't evolve in the capitalist direction with the kulaks or in the socialist direction with the semi-proletarians and laborers. Of course, it is not a question of claiming that this kind of rural production will exist forever, but it is obvious that it can exist for a certain stage of the evolution of humanity, corresponding to a given technology and market conditions, end quote. The reason I'm reading that is this question of agriculture and the question of the kulaks, and the question of like what was the nature of agriculture prior to the Russian Revolution and after is a key part of the text by John Eric Marot that I found very, very persuasive when I first read it. Other people might not feel that way, and I'm not an expert on it, but his piece that's like on like Stalinism and the left opposition in the like late 1920s, I think I need to reread that and put that on the channel because I reference it all the time, and maybe there's problems with it that I would see now, but at the time when I read it, I was like, that seems like very apt. The guy basically argues that Bukharin was right in the debate, and that the only possibility for establishing a democratic socialism would be the extension of the new economic policy and a rebuilding of democracy, socialist democracy, without the breakneck industrialization. Which of course took an extremely authoritarian, indeed totalitarian manner in the Soviet Union. Anyway, if the kulaks do not have the capitalist character that Trotsky attributes to them, then their activity does not, this is after the quote, by the way, this is back to Botz. If the kulaks do not have the capitalist character that Trotsky attributes to the kulaks, then their activity does not account for the Stalinist center's zigzags. The kulaks then cannot explain the nature of the Soviet Union or that of the Communist Party and the Communist Party's factions. That is, Souvarine rejects the foundation of Trotsky's analysis. If the kulaks are not tending toward capitalism, then the kulaks are not responsible for the Stalinist center's zigzags. Then something else must account for the politics of Stalin. Much of the long letter, about a third of it, deals with the question of democracy in the revolutionary movement and in the revolutionary state. Souvarine derided Trotsky for failing to consistently put forward a thoroughly democratic program. Quote, "You already asked for, quote, inter-party democracy, end quote, in 1923. 3 years later, you stammered out quite timid democratic demands in favor of the trade unions. Then 3 years after that, you advocated a secret ballot in the party, and to a lesser extent in the trade unions. But all these partial demands throw light on your hesitation to confront the difficulty, your hesitations in confronting the difficulty in its full extent. ... Unless you were thinking about substituting purely and simply the dictatorship of one clan for that of another clan, it would have been better to define, however approximately, the limits, forms, and extent of the dictatorship, and what guarantees are there to protect the citizens." End quote. Souvarine. Finally, Souvarine disagreed with Trotsky's desire to expel the German right communists, Brandler and Thalheimer. Souvarine's statement is really a fundamentally different conception about how to build a revolutionary party. Quote, "To make a provisional conclusion about Brandler and Thalheimer, I will oppose my criterion to yours. Given the state of..." This is Souvarine, sorry. Quote, "To make a provisional conclusion about Brandler and Thalheimer, I will oppose my criterion to yours. Given the state of the International, we must in every country save what can be saved for the future of socialism and communism. And to start off with this presupposes that we free the healthy young people from the leaderships, whether right or left, of, quote, Moscow, end quote, and allow them to lead themselves, to go beyond imperative outside instructions, to think out their policies, and to gather together a real working class elite for class activity," end quote. There is no doubt that in his letter, Souvarine had caricatured Trotsky in much the same way as he accused Trotsky of caricaturing others, yet its political arguments were also clear. Souvarine's long letter to Trotsky, while rambling and anecdotal at times, was a ferocious political critique that suggested that a crucial moment in the history of the communist movement, Trotsky had failed to understand what was happening in the Soviet Union, could not explain the factionalism in the Communist International, and misunderstood developments in other countries. It also represented an alternative political analysis and strategy for the communist movement, analysis and strategy that would broaden the communist leadership, expand democratic rights in the Soviet Union and the party, and attempt to engage in genuine alliances with other working class organizations. By sending the letter, Souvarine was clearly breaking with Trotsky. Not surprisingly, Trotsky responded with a short note reading Souvarine out of the movement, ending his short dismissive letter with this remark, quote, "Register a man overboard. Continue with the business of the day," end quote. Damn, yo. I'm definitely siding, for me in this debate, I'm definitely more sympathetic to Souvarine than to Trotsky, but that's like some fucking, that's like a fucking diss track banger right there. Register a man overboard, continue with the business of the day. And the following month, he could send a cold and disdainful note to Souvarine's group, the Marx and Lenin Circle. Footnote. Leon Trotsky, letter sent to Souvarine, July 3rd, 1929. And the following month, Trotsky would send a cold and disdainful note to Souvarine's group, the Marx and Lenin Circle. That's in Leon Trotsky's collected writings of 1929, letter to the Marx and Lenin Circle. Back to the text. Following his long letter, Souvarine went on to write a book on the Soviet Union, Le Russie Nu? I don't know. Originally published in 1920, named under the name of Souvarine's friend, the novelist Penai Istrati? I don't fucking know. But then released a year later under Souvarine's own name as Le URSS. I don't know how to say that in French. The USSR in 1930 is what I'm assuming that's translated to. Principally using Soviet sources, is a combination of economic statistics, case studies, and illustrative anecdotes, in the first 200 pages of which the author painted a devastating picture of the Soviet bureaucracy's exploitation of the working class and of the workers' own miserable and oppressive conditions. Then a long 60-page chapter titled The Dictatorship of the Proletariat provided a detailed description of how the bureaucratic dictatorship functioned, the bureaucracy claiming all power for itself and denying any power to the workers. Souvarine asserted that despite a constitution that called for democracy, in reality the Soviet Union was ruled by the Communist Party's Secretariat, Political Bureau, Organizational Bureau, and Control Commission. Sorry, I was just saying if there's a footnote here, which is the citation for a French source. The communists who controlled those offices not only ran the party, but through the party also controlled the Soviets and the labor unions. Throughout the entire system, offices were filled by co-optation and appointment without elections. The will of the party was enforced by the secret police, the GPU. Quote, "There does not exist in bourgeois society a police force as broad and as complete," end quote, he wrote. Souvarine argued in the USSR in 1930 that the, quote, state religion of Leninism, end quote, was a, quote, reactionary phenomenon representing the conservative interest of new classes in formation, the ideology of an emerging bureaucratic autocracy, the consolidation of which will render the restoration of capitalism inevitable, end quote. Souvarine, it appeared, no longer saw the Communist Party as the locus of the struggle against Stalin. He wrote, quote, "There incontestably exist in the USSR several thousand communists intent, some of them consciously so, but they are not for the most part in the party," end quote. The communists were, Souvarine said, in internal exile in Siberia, Turkestan, or the Arctic Circle, in concentration camps or in prisons, and while some remained in the party, they remained silent for fear of repression. Like Trotsky, Souvarine still believed at this point that Thermidor would lead to capitalism. Impressive as it is as an account of the Soviet Union in 1930, the book failed to provide what one could call a political analysis, description, and theory of the Soviet system as a whole. In this period, Souvarine moved further from Soviet communism. In 1930, the Marx-Lenin Circle, which Souvarine led, changed its name to the Democratic Communist Circle, a name that still identified it with the communist tradition rather than that of social democracy, but clearly an opposition group. A year later, Souvarine founded a new journal, La Critique Sociale, bringing together a range of leftist intellectuals and avant-garde thinkers. The journal defined itself as a Marxist journal, based on the historic mission of the working class. Finally, in 1935, Souvarine published his biography of Stalin, a process that his biographer suggested was Souvarine's way of working himself out of the communist movement. Souvarine anti-communist. In the late 1940s and 50s, Boris Souvarine broke with his earlier revolutionary socialist critique of Stalinism and became pro-Western, pro-American, and anti-communist. In the summer of 1948, Souvarine founded the journal Observatoire du Monde, observer of two worlds, that is, observer of the capitalist and of the communist worlds. At the time, Souvarine continued to be extremely critical of Stalin, the Soviet Union, and the communist parties, but could also be critical, though less so, of the capitalist countries. For example, in one article for the New Journal, he pointed out the limitations of American democracy, where the two dominant parties tended to impose themselves on voters. Souvarine's associate in founding the journal was Georges Albertini, sometimes called, quote, eminence grise of anti-communism. I'm going to look some of this shit up. For one, I'm going to look up eminence grise. Okay, and George Albertini, if my internet will work.
Éminence grise.
Eminence grise translates to power behind the throne. So eminence grise of anti-communism means the power behind the throne of anti-communism. And George Albertini, let's get a translation here. I have to use the French Wikipedia. George Albertini was born the 13th of May, 1911 in Chalon-sur-Saône and died on March 30th, 1983 in Paris. He was a socialist and pacifist politician before the Second World War, subsequently involved in the collaboration. After the war, he led an anti-communist organization, notably the magazine Est and West, which I guess means East and West, and became an eminence grise of several politicians, including Georges Pompidou. I guess, what's it say here? This is in French, the French about eminence grise. An eminence grise is an influential advisor who can go so far as to actually exercise power while remaining in the shadows of a political or public figure. Makes me think of like Worm Tongue from the Lord of the Rings. So that's who Georges Albertini is. So, Souvarine's associate in founding the journal was Georges Albertini, sometimes called the, quote, eminence grise of anti-communism, end quote, a former Nazi collaborator. After the war, Albertini was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but had the luck to have his cellmate, the wealthy Jewish armament manufacturer and banker Hippolyte Worms, who would later help to bankroll Albertini's subsequent enterprises. says Hippolyte Worms was a French businessman who inherited an interest in Worms AC, a major operator in the coal trade and in merchant shipping. Hippolyte Worms expanded his firm into shipbuilding and merchant banking and found Bank Worms, or Worms Bank. Emerging from prison, Albertini repented his collaboration, became a socialist, and even served as an erstwhile consultant to the Communist Party. With Worms' support, he began to publish the Bulletin d'études et d'information des politiques internationales, the Bulletin of Studies and of Information on International Politics, or BEIPI. Souvarine, an expert on the Soviet Union, became a regular contributor. Souvarine also developed contacts with a wide variety of political figures, many of them anti-communists, from Irving Brown of the AFL-CIO. There's a lot of people here. Irving Brown was an American trade unionist and leader of the American Federation of Labor and subsequently the AFL-CIO. Brown played a prominent role in Western Europe and Africa during the Cold War in splintering communist-led labor movements. Along with former Communist Party of the USA member J. Lovestone, he founded the American Institute for Free Labor Development. I know who Max Eastman is. It doesn't say who James Farrell is. He doesn't pop up right away. I'm not going to go digging for him in the search engine. And James Burnham. So we have Irving Brown of the AFL-CIO, Max Eastman, James Farrell, James Burnham, who was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Trotskyist movement in the United States. So it was I don't know how long Max Eastman was in the Trotskyist movement, but he was definitely a Trotsky person. And Gordon Wasson. Shit. Who's Gordon Wasson? R. Gordon Wasson was an American author, ethnomycologist, and vice president of public relations at J.P. Morgan & Co. In the course of work funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, Wasson made contributions to the fields of ethnobotany, botany, and anthropology. During the Cold War years, back to the text. During the Cold War years, Souvarine directed much of his energy to criticizing French newspapers that he saw as leaning toward the communists or even collaborators of the communists, and that was most of them. As his biographer describes him, Souvarine became, quote, the sentinel of the free world, end quote. After 1935, Souvarine's rightward movement was continuous. In 1968, Souvarine supported the United States in its war in Vietnam, criticizing the Americans, however, for being too restrained. The North Vietnamese government was the aggressor, he argued, and a communist government would only respect force. Souvarine criticized the American Constitution because it constrained the power of the president, and he looked back fondly at the role of the bellicose General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. Souvarine's position on the Vietnam War was made clear that he had become a right-wing ideologue. Not surprisingly then, during the May 1968 events, Souvarine condemned the student movement, referring to the young young Maoists as, quote, ignoramuses and beasts, end quote, wrote that, quote, the Trotskyists were really Stalinists, end quote, ridiculed the admirers of Castro and Che who had mistaken Paris for the mountains and jungles of Latin America, and declared that the anarchists, having given up the violent propaganda of the deed, were incapable of scaring even a timorous bourgeoisie, but had, quote, greatly helped to bring about the electoral victory of the party of order, de Gaulle, end quote. Happy with that outcome, still Souvarine scored and savaged the Fifth Republic, as weak as its predecessor, for having given in to the demand for a reform of university education. So depressing. Discussion and conclusion. Final section. Boris Souvarine, who had been a revolutionary from 1918 to 1935 and by the 1950s became an arch reactionary, of that there is no doubt. Yet it would be a mistake to attempt to draw a straight line from his differences with the Communist Party in the mid-1920s or with Trotsky in the late 1920s to his reactionary views during the Cold War. Nothing in his positions of the 1920s and early 1930s necessarily led to or could have predicted his later views, nor did his later opinions somehow erase the accuracy and the usefulness of his earlier analyses. We will not find it helpful to talk about his, quote, betrayal, end quote, or to attribute this to his social class. Souvarine, once a revolutionary, should best be seen as a victim of both Stalinism and capitalism, a revolutionary transformed into a reactionary by the world forces that he had earlier attempted to fight, capitalism and Stalinist communism. Boris Souvarine lost, and so did the left. Trotsky, too, was a victim, both figuratively and literally. Stalin drove Trotsky out of the Soviet Union, and the European capitalist countries denied him safe refuge, a man without a haven until Mexico opened its doors. Trotsky found himself reduced to leading a handful of followers in a half-dozen countries. While Trotsky provided some brilliant political analyses, particularly his analysis of the situation in Germany in the late 1920s and 1930s, his Fourth International proved to be a complete failure in his time, and, as his widow Natalia argued, many of his followers became apologists for Stalin's Soviet Union and its conquest of Eastern Europe. With that in mind, we should look back at this debate with some sympathy for both parties. My argument here is that Souvarine made real contributions to a socialist analysis of the events of his time. What were those? First, his analysis in the 1920s, especially after 1926, when he began to break with Trotsky, was perceptive. Souvarine correctly identified many of the problems of Soviet communism, of the Communist International, and of the opposition and Trotsky. In retrospect, it is clear that Trotsky, who had based it on his analysis of the Russian economy, who had based his analysis of the Russian economy on the netmen and the kulaks, had completely misunderstood their role, particularly that of the kulaks. This meant that Trotsky also misunderstood what was happening in Soviet society and was completely mistaken about the rise of Stalin and what he called the, quote, center, end quote. Stalin was not zigzagging between capitalism and socialism, at first unconsciously and then consciously. Stalin led and embodied an emerging new force, the Soviet bureaucracy, that was fixated on consolidating the power of the Secretariat, controlling the party, and dominating the state. The emerging force would become a new class with its own interests, contrary to those of the working class. And just as a footnote, I think Daniel Botz is like a third campus guy. I think he writes a lot for New Politics. I'm not exactly sure about his politics, but I believe that's what he's about. Trotsky's initial analysis of developments in the Soviet Union in the new course had been brilliant, but by the late 1920s he failed to understand that the principal danger to socialism came from Stalin, not from the right opposition. Trotsky's analysis utterly disoriented and disarmed his followers in Russia and around the world, all of which would become much more serious once Stalin had completely established his hold on the system by the late 1930s. Trotsky's position made it impossible for him to consider, much less enter into an alliance, with Bukharin and the right opposition that might have stopped Stalin and the rise of Stalinism. I think that mistake of Trotsky's can be compared to Stalin's making impossible the alliance of communists and social democrats, which could have stopped the rise of Hitler. It's a very interesting analysis. I'm going to read that last sentence again. I think that Trotsky's position made it impossible for him to consider, much less enter into, an alliance with Bukharin and the right opposition that might have stopped Stalin and the rise of Stalinism. I think that mistake of Trotsky's can be compared to Stalin's making impossible the alliance of communists with the Social Democrats, which could have stopped the rise of Hitler. Secondly, Souvarine was right on the question of democracy. Trotsky had become convinced that the fight had to be carried out within the Communist Party and not in the Russian working class and society at large. Trotsky believed that only in the party could one find real and potential revolutionaries. Souvarine, on the other hand, believed that the party had changed since the Lenin levy of 1923-25, having become a party of peasants dragooned into the working class, while many of the real communists could be found not in the party but in prison, in concentration camps, in Siberia and the Arctic region of Russia, or simply among the non-party members, and yes, some remained in the party, keeping their heads down, waiting for another day. Oh shit, I missed a footnote. A number of the modern historians agree with Souvarine over Trotsky. See, for example, Moshe Lewin, The Making of the Soviet System, who discusses just how elusive the identity of the kulak was and how the communists multiplied definitions of the kulak without ever succeeding in getting a grip on him. That's the first one. Oh, no, this is the same footnote. Chapter 5, quote, Who was the kulak, end quote, in Making of the Soviet System, pages 121 to 41. I'm going to write that down, actually. Where am I? Oh wow, he actually references this John Merritt. And more to the point, see John Merritt, The October Revolution in Retrospect, Interventions in Russian and Soviet History. Chapter 1, The Peasant Question and the Origins of Stalinism, Rethinking the Destruction of the October Revolution, pages 11 to 86, which absolutely agrees with Souvarine's position, though Souvarine is not discussed. God, I'm perceptive. No, just kidding. I'm an asshole. Unlike Trotsky, Souvarine did not believe that the democratization of the Soviet Union could come from the party. That is, from the bureaucracy itself, but rather would have to come from the genuine communists, many of whom Souvarine believed were no longer in the party. Simply extending the vote within the party and other institutions would not suffice, not when there was no secret ballot and any vote against the bureaucracy meant losing one's job or perhaps imprisonment, exile, or even death. Souvarine would have agreed with Otto Urbans that workers need, quote, the right to organize, end quote, perhaps needed that right above all. And as Souvarine pointed out, the right to organize implies freedom of the press and other rights, none of which existed in the Soviet Union. I feel like I should criticize this piece for not mentioning Kronstadt at all. Very important in my mind in understanding the question of democracy in the Soviet Union. Anyway, third, Souvarine was right that, quote, Leninism, end quote, and, quote, Bolshevism, end quote, as understood by everyone in the communist movement, were liabilities. While Lenin was a strategic and tactical genius, the Bolshevik party Lenin created for the conditions of the Tsarist autocracy was not a model for a new society in Russia, nor for other parties in countries with other conditions, certainly not after the period of war communism when militarism became the model and workers were stripped of all democratic rights. After Lenin died, quote, Bolshevism and, quote, Leninism became terms to justify the dominance of the bureaucracy and to provide ideological justification for a host of authoritarian practices. This term rationalized Moscow's domination over the International's domination over the member parties' leaders' domination over the members, and the members' domination over the working class organization in which they participated. And as both Souvarine and Victor Serge argued, Trotsky himself had adopted a, quote, degenerated Bolshevism, end quote, rife with authoritarian characteristics. If one really admired the best of the Russian revolutionary tradition, one could not be a, quote, Leninist or a, quote, Bolshevik, end quote. Fourth, Souvarine was right that the Communist International's modus operandi had been a failure, and that it represented a mistaken approach. All of the Communist International's interventions in the 1920s had led to failure, from Germany to China, in large part because Moscow thought that it could impose its analysis, vision, and strategy on the workers' movement of other countries. Comintern leaders in the 1920s believed that they knew what was best for other workers' movements, often holding local leaders and parties in contempt. By the 1930s, things would degenerate further, with the Communist International becoming a political arm of the Soviet Union's bureaucracy and a special tool for its foreign policy. Finally, Souvarine was right about Trotsky's role and his method. Trotsky's hubris was extraordinary. He appeared to believe that he alone knew what was best for the communist movement. I mean, I can't agree with that more. I mean, just his tone and the way that he writes is like so self-certain, which I guess is what you're trying. You have to be if you're, It kind of comes with the territory of his whole conception of revolution is the attitude that follows from that. But that's just my thoughts. It's not Botz's thoughts. As Trotsky himself would write in 1935, quote, "I cannot say that I was indispensable to the October Revolution, but today my work is absolutely indispensable, and this is not arrogance. The collapse of the two internationals, socialist and communist, has posed a problem which none of their leaders was or is able to solve. The vicissitudes of my personal fate have confronted me with this problem and armed me with important experience in dealing with it. There is now no one except me to carry out the mission of arming a new generation with revolutionary method," end quote. What's that from? Trotsky, Diary in Exile, 1935. Entry for March 25th, 46 to 47. Because Trotsky believed that he was the only one who knew what was best, he tended to reject genuine collaboration with people like Souvarine or later Victor Serge or Andres Nin or Henk Snevliet. I'm going to assume that you know who the first two people are. Andres Nin was a person of the PUM, the Party of Marxist Unification, I believe, in the Spanish Civil War. Andrew Nin, come on. I think it's Andrew Nin is what it's saying on Wikipedia. Okay, Andre Nin y Perez was a Catalan politician, trade unionist, and translator. Nin is mainly known for his role in various Spanish left-wing movements of the early 20th century and later for his role in the Spanish Civil War. Nin is also known for his work translating Russian classics such as Anna Karenina, Crime and Punishment, and some works by Anton Chekhov from Russian into Catalan. A teacher and journalist, during his youth he was involved in various political movements until he joined the anarchist Confederación Nacional del Trabajo. During his stay in Russia, he witnessed the Russian Revolution, which marked his conversion to Marxism. After his return to Spain, Nin later became one of the founders of the small but active Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. That was the militia that Orwell was involved in this when he in Homage to Catalonia. Nin eventually became a leading figure in Spanish revolutionary Marxism. He disappeared during the course of the Spanish Civil War, having been arrested by the Republican authorities following the May Days. I couldn't encourage you to read or listen to the audiobook of Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. Because the people the repression that they were facing, not from the fascists but from Republican side, is tremendous. Henk Snevliet. I actually have a piece that I just put up recently. I don't know, it's March 14th when I'm reading this. That was about Dutch Trotskyism. And it's about Trotsky. A lot of it features debates debates between Trotsky and Snevliet, or Trotsky's critique of Snevliet. So I'll just read this little Wikipedia introduction. Hendrikus Josephus Franciscus Marie Snevliet, known as Henk Snevliet, or by the pseudonym Maring, was a Dutch communist politician who was active in the Netherlands and Dutch East Indies. As a functionary of the Communist International, Snevliet guided the formation of both the Communist Party of Indonesia in 1914. That's not right. Maybe that's a preliminary to the Communist Party in Indonesia, but that can't be right. Let me look at that. And the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. In Snevliet's native country, Snevliet was the founder, chairman, and only representative for the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party, RSP/RSAP. Snevliet took part in the communist resistance against the occupation of the Netherlands during World War II by Nazi Germany, for which he was executed by the Germans in April 1942. Damn, it says on the Communist Party of Indonesia was founded in 1914 on the other page, so couldn't just be a typo unless Wikipedia as a whole is wrong. It says the Communist Party of Indonesia was a communist party in the Dutch East Indies and later Indonesia. The Communist Party of Indonesia was the largest non-ruling communist party in the world before its violent disbandment in 1965. The party had 2 million members in the 1955 election and 16% of the national vote and almost 30% of the vote in East Java. During the most of the period immediately following the Indonesian independence, until the eradication of the PKI in 1965, it was a legal party operating openly in the country. So that's who Henk Snevliet is. And Andres Nin. I'll reread that sentence. Because he believed that he was the only one who knew what was best, Trotsky tended to reject genuine collaboration with people like Souvarine, or later Victor Serge, Andres Nin, or Henk Snevliet, just as he rejected a political collaboration with other political groups. Consequently, Trotsky tended to have followers, not collaborators. Trotsky's method of argument with political opponents and even potential allies was all too often simply to state that they were, quote, on the other side of the barricades, end quote, that they held right-wing ideas and therefore represented the bourgeoisie in the communist movement. Trotsky's followers often adopted the method as well, even exaggerating it, giving their organizations the character of a sect. This is not to entirely deny Trotsky's many contributions through his life, but simply to recognize Trotsky's limitations. While Souvarine had many insights and described many of the problems of the Soviet Union and the communist movement in compelling ways, he never pulled together what could be called a systematic analysis of the Soviet Union. The two main pieces of his analysis, the political character of the bureaucracy and the economic system of state capitalism, never amounted to a theory, but they anticipated and strongly resembled the more complete analyses of Bruno Rizzi, Max Shachtman, David Rousset, I don't know who that is, and Tony Cliff. I'm going to assume you know who all those people are. Because I do. Who's David Rousset? I don't know if this is the guy, but I'm going to assume it is. David Rousset was a French writer and political activist, a recipient of Prix Ronaldo, a French literary award, a survivor of the Neuengamme concentration camp and the Buchenwald Nazi concentration camp. Rousseau is famous for his books about concentration camps. Rousseau was the first person to use the term gulag in the French language, revealing to the French the Soviet system of labor camps. In 1949, learning that while the concentration camps in Nazi Germany had been destroyed, camps still existed in the Soviet Union, he appealed to former inmates of Nazi camps to form a commission to inspect the USSR camps, which became the, quote, International Commission Against Concentrationist Regimes, end quote. For his effort, he was attacked by Pierre Daye in the French communist newspaper Les Lettres Françaises, which accused him of slandering the Soviet Union, forging the text of the Soviet laws, and spreading misinformation. Rousseau brought libel charges against the newspaper, and in 1951, he won the case. Along with Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Gerard Rosenthal, Rousseau was a founder of the left-wing Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, revolutionary democratic rally which called for a European federation on democratic socialist lines. In 1968, Rousseau was elected as deputy of the French National Assembly as a left-wing Gaullist. Rousseau resigned in November 1970. So I didn't know who David Rousseau was. Still, the socialist movement of today can profit from reading Souvarine of 1925 to 1935 period, both for their historical importance and because the lessons drawn there have contemporary relevance for building a new socialist movement. The conclusion that I draw from this debate is that Trotsky's position made it impossible for him to understand that the most dangerous threat to the socialist movement in Russia in the late 1920s came not from Bukharin and the right, but from Stalin and the center. While this was not at all clear in the early 1920s, it had become clearer in the late 1920s. Though only in the 1930s would it become absolutely clear that Stalin and the bureaucracy had evolved into a new social class hostile to both capitalism and socialism, and out of the Soviet Union had emerged a new type of class society, bureaucratic collectivism. Okay, so yeah, he's like a Shachtmanite third camp person. Probably big fan of Hal Draper, which is sick because I like a lot of things that Hal Draper says. Anyway, where am I? Trotsky's position made it impossible for him to consider forging an alliance with Bukharin and the right to try to save the revolution from Stalinist counter-revolution and the horrors that entailed. As he wrote, quote, "There cannot even be talk of a bloc between the left opposition and the right opposition," end quote. Yet the Trotskyist left and the Bukharinist right might have united to fight to preserve as much democracy and as much of socialism as it was possible to save in the 1920s, had they joined together in what Sam Farber has called, quote, a tactical bloc for, quote, democratic survival, end quote. End quote. Sam Farber wrote a book. It's like, I don't know if it's The Fate of Soviet Democracy. Maybe that's even what this is a citation from. Sam Farber, Before Stalinism, The Rise and Fall of Soviet Democracy. Yeah. If such a bloc had been created, there might have been something like the continuation of the new economic policy while awaiting other developments. The Soviet state might have had to be reconstructed. It might even have evolved into or been replaced by a capitalist state, though perhaps one with a strong communist party and militant labor unions. But Stalinism would not have cohered into a new class and society, and we might imagine perhaps Hitler might never have come to power. We should take from the Trotsky-Souvarine debate a greater appreciation of the role of democratic rights at every level of the socialist movement and in every attempt to build socialism. Working-class democracy should always entail the right to self-organization, including the right to organize tendencies within the party. It doesn't say the like that, but it says the party. It means the right to multi-party democracy, which also means freedom of the press. And, of course, it always means, above all, the right to organize within the working class, its unions and its political parties, and within society as a whole. And that's the end, and it says, all translations from French and Spanish by the author. Thanks for the helpful comments and useful criticism to those who read and commented on my draft, not all of whom agree with my argument or my conclusions. Jean Battelle, who I don't know, Bob Brenner, or Robert Brenner, who wrote, famous for the Robert Brenner debate, and is kind of like the theoretical model that John Merritt uses in his critique of, or his work on the, I guess, like the development debates in the Soviet Union, which are very good. Sam Farber, third camp guy. Barry Finger, third camp guy, writes very good critiques of anti-Zionism. Russ Gilbert, Michael Hirsch, John Merritt, John Riddell, and Julia Wrigley. I am also indebted to Susie Weissman, whose work on Victor Serge has helped me to better understand the kinds of questions posed when reading Souvarine. Of course, I am alone responsible for the final product. I thought that was a very insightful essay, and I'm glad that I read it. I hope you are glad you listened to it. Bye-bye.